Right, morning, folks. Sorry about the late start. So my name's Kim Gillen. Thanks for coming on the final morning of the conference. This is the first of a pair of sessions. So the theme of both panels is community power and the next system. This first section has the title Theorizing Next System Design and Community Power. So these panels have been organised by Karis Hughes, who's here, and Ben Munsky, who is, I think, in America somewhere, and will, I think, join us on Zoom for the second session. There's been a request to record these sessions. So what we've got running is a Zoom that we don't have anyone joined. They might join at some point during the session. So we've got that recording for the presentations, and it's open, I think, whether you're willing to have the discussion recorded. It would be shared with students mostly, would it? Is that the or the world?
But we don't have to include the discussion.
Yeah. Would anyone? How should we do this? Has anyone got any objection to recording? No, I'll make it opt out so that it's a bit awkward, isn't it? But there we go. Okay, so speakers in this session are prepared to present for 18 minutes, breaking the usual conference rules. But because I'm really soft, I've not said anything about it. So we've got Simon Thorpe, Martin Greenwood, Claudia Firth, and Karis Hughes. I won't say anything else by way of introduction. Let the speakers speak for themselves. So Simon, take it away.
Okay.
We'll need to, if you open your slides and then share, do you know how to share by Zoom?
Oh, it's been a while.
Right, we can. Sort of channel pandemic.
We need this plugged in. Still.
No, we don't actually. Well, if we go share entire screen and then your presentation.
Well, then it might show the presenter notes rather than the main slide.
You probably won't. The way this system is set up, it's really hard to get the presenter notes. Okay. So if you were to go full screen, yeah, that's what you're sharing. Right. So I'll give you a little warning at 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll start my own timer as well. And then start. Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for getting here so bright and early. I'm Simon Thorpe. I'm a lecturer in the law school at the University of Westminster. I've somehow managed to make something of a career so far, convincing law schools to pay me to, among other things, do research on social movements and politics by framing it as constitutional theory. Social movements as I think it makes sense, but it's always an interesting challenge, you know, framing it in the right way for job applications and whatnot, and my PhD proposal. So yeah, social movements as generators of constitutional theory, producing a concept that I call prefigurative constitutionality, these emergent constitutional forms of praxis that social movements are generating implicitly in their organizing, to the extent that they are explicitly prefigurative movements. They are explicitly prefiguring some kind of future radical, well, future different society, be it one of radical democracy or white supremacy or whatever. There's a very interesting article out there on like white power movements in the US as prefigurative movements, for example. So let me get into the actual slides and start with a little history lesson that probably no one in this room really needs, to lead you into the main case study that I focused on in my PhD, which I'm still trying to get published, including in an article with Karis here being guest editor for, was it Global Social Challenges Journal. So the case study is Municipalism in Madrid. I'm going to start with the case study and then do the theory kind of at the end. I thought I'd reverse the usual order of how I usually present this for other venues, where I start with the theory and see how much time there's left over for the case study, the opposite way around here. So municipalism in Spain cannot be understood, cannot be explained, could not have happened without the 15M movement, beginning on the 15th of May, the kind of, you might know it as the Spanish Occupy, although it happened first. Occupy was very much inspired by 15M. Both were inspired in part by things like the occupation of Tahrir Square in Cairo during Arab Spring, as well as the slightly longer tradition of the ultra-global movement, the anti-summit protests that developed this kind of repertoire of prefigurative camp communities with all the different functions dotted around, libraries, kitchens, the assembly, the sort of the horizontalist assembly democracy, decision-making model, which is my particular interest. Here's what it looked like on one day in Zuccotti Park in New York when it became the Occupy movement and spread around the world. Known for, among other things, its repertoire of hand signals to facilitate this kind of mass assembly democracy. And so what I found thinking about this concept of prefigurative politics is that a lot of scholarship really kind of doesn't define it as such. It really just defines it as what these particular movements do. And it traces this genealogy, usually following something like this chain from classical anarchism to the nonviolent direct action movements in the US and from the 70s, the ultra-global movement, movements of the squares, etc., characterized by this repertoire of consensus decision-making, etc. Safer spaces policies is a perhaps often overlooked part of this that really sparked my interest back in the day in the kind of the constitutional dynamics of these assembly processes, where they actually start writing down rules, but very different kinds of rules to the liberal constitutional rules that we are familiar with in liberal capitalist states. Now, I'll come back to how I think we should maybe reconsider defining prefiguration itself beyond just what these particular movements happen to do after I finish the case study story, because simultaneously, well, not simultaneously, but immediately following the kind of an ebb in the wave of energy of 15M in Spain, we had this kind of period of malaise when they realized they weren't actually getting the people in power to listen to any of their demands or having any kind of real impact on policy or the economy or big issues at the time, right? Like the Troika imposing, you know, restructuring conditions on Spain and Greece, etc. There was this malaise, and two academics in particular, some others, these were the most important two, from Complutense University in Madrid, political scientists who've been studying Mas in Bolivia and Correa in Ecuador, and Chavez in Venezuela, among other things, Pablo Iglesias and Inigo Errejón, came up with this idea to, first of all, they read 15M not as many participants did as a primarily prefigurative moment or prefigurative movement. They thought it was actually more of a, or more importantly perhaps, a populist moment. It was the formation of a new popular subject, a new division of society between us and them. La casta is the term they kind of come up with to define that other, the elite, the establishment, the caste, literally, versus some new understanding of a progressive, capital P, people. And in fact, learning from Latin America, they think, well, there's this moment of malaise in the movements, and so actually, maybe we can mirror what happened in Latin America in many places and use charismatic leadership to revive these movements. And they draw very explicitly on the work of Ernesto Leclau and Chantal Mouffe. Errejón literally wrote his PhD as a Leclauian analysis, hegemonic discourse analysis of Mas in Bolivia. And it's one of the most direct applications of a very specific theory to concrete politics that I'm aware of, which I found very fascinating, and it's part of my motivation for looking at Spain at that time. But I didn't just look at Podemos. I primarily wanted to look at this other branch of post-15M electoralism, where, again, this was a common refrain at the time. What's the point of shouting at the institutions if no one inside is listening? Well, then let's get our own people inside the institutions, because they will listen. But the more kind of anarchic 15M activists who were interested in electoralism, but were a bit distrustful of this populist, this like very staunchly populist strategy that Podemos was espousing, took a different approach. The key text here is La Apuesta Municipalista, the Municipalist Wager, by a collective called Observatorio Metropolitano de Madrid, that kind of puts forward this bet, this gamble, this wager, frames a kind of a municipalist political theory, drawing on people like Murray Bookchin a little bit, but less than you might think, for someone who's known for his theory of libertarian municipalism, drawing equally on the CUP, the radical kind of anarcho-electoral Catalan party, various Dutch experiments, all sorts of things. And that kind of sets municipalism up as the kind of more horizontalist, arguably more kind of radical democratic electoral alternative to the Podemos national project. And a whole host of what they called citizen platforms were formed in towns and cities, all the municipalities of Madrid, to contest the 2015 local elections. And this became known as the new municipalism. Basically, it spawned a global new municipalist movement that's been studied quite heavily. And my interest initially was that it seemed to be this incredibly novel fusion of this tradition of prefigurative politics that had always been thought of as largely anti-institutional, with electoralism and the concomitant need that electoralism brings to actually institutionalize that anti-institutional politics in some form. So in Madrid, the initial municipalist project is called Ganemos Madrid, Let's Win Madrid. First it was Municipalia, they have a couple of Municipalia assemblies, and they changed the name to Ganemos, mirroring the more famous municipalist project in Barcelona, Guanyem Barcelona, Let's Win Barcelona. But there's this crazy contingency that happens where just at the end of 2014, start of 2015, Podemos happened to be the highest in the polls that they will ever be, that they have ever been or will ever be. And they even just briefly go above PSOE, the main center-left party, just when Ganemos having to decide, do we go it alone in these local elections, or do we need to make some kind of deal with Podemos to sort of build on their popularity? And they decide, yeah, okay, look, they're beating PSOE, we've got to do a deal. Little do they know, as I say, this is the highest Podemos will ever be in the polls. But they do a deal, they form Ahora Madrid, now Madrid. Here's a brilliant diagram produced by one of the lists in the open primaries to elect the councillor candidates and the mayoral candidate for the local elections. I won't go into all of this because I'm running swiftly out of time, but just to give you a sense of the complexity, right? It goes from this single space defined by the concept of confluence, which is this kind of anti-old party logic. It implies that everyone should come to this assembly space as individuals, not as representatives of exogenous groups. That's the Ganemos idea. It's this kind of multitudinous, rhizomatic kind of web of singularities in my kind of Deleuze-Negrian framework. Two, this kind of old logic of coalition. As soon as you do a deal with Podemos, you have to do a deal with Izquierda Unida, the main classic sort of left-wing party, and then you want to do a deal with the Podemos dissidents. Where's the Podemos dissident group? I think that one was this kind of non-Pablo Iglesias Podemos faction, and others, right? So they do the deal, they form the party, they get Manuela Carmena as their mayoral candidate. She's a retired judge, a former member of the Spanish Communist Party while it was banned under Franco, so she's got this kind of radical heritage, but then also she's this respectable institutional figure as a retired judge. She's this older woman, and she kind of welcomes this identification as this friendly grandmother figure. And you get this electoral campaign that it turns out was incredibly, surprisingly, in fact, successful, using some populist techniques, including really focusing on the face of the leader, which was pioneered by Pablo Iglesias and Podemos in the 2014 European elections, which was the first time ever that a party had put just the face of the leader as their party icon on the ballot paper. And from then on, in Barcelona, in Madrid, and for Podemos nationally, you know, the face of the leader becomes this kind of, becomes adopted as what seems to be a very effective, for a while, tool to create this kind of empty signifier in the Crowleyan terms that people can invest whatever they want in. And you get these kind of, this masks for Manuela movement, people kind of making masks out of their hands, out of bits of card. You get graphic designers coming out of the woodwork to, I was going to quickly show you this page that you can look up. I don't know, this won't get recorded, but it's just this explosion of grassroots energy. A graphic designer is just doing whatever they want, making posters, making memes, putting them up in the streets, spreading them online, etc., etc. And where's my present remote? There we go. Sorry, more complicated than okay, there we go. Shouldn't have taken so long, right? And then to everyone's surprise, Manuela was promised she wouldn't have to actually be mayor. She would just be a figurehead to, like, you know, get them into a strong second place, maybe in the city hall, and take it from there. But to everyone's surprise, they win, kind of. They're like one seat short of the centre-right party, but they're able to form a government with support of the centre-left. And Manuela Carmena becomes mayor, and this is the team of councillors that join her to control City Hall. Now, I won't go into all of the problems that Aurora Madrid then faced as this kind of mutant, horizontalist, populist, and kind of managerialist from the Manuela side, it turned out, project that comes to be dominated very much by Manuela and her closer allies with the support of Podemos. Maybe we can get into that in the questions. My main interest in PhD and today is the incredible radicalism of what Ganemos themselves were proposing. This is a brilliant organogram. Oh, I see this is on the screen, isn't it? So how do I get rid of that? Yeah, there we go, that'll do. This is their organogram. The plenary includes everything. Plenary is the assembly of all members, but there's no formal membership, so it's the plenary of anyone who wants to turn up, essentially. Within that, the working groups work on policy proposals. You've got the coordination committee in the middle overseeing, but in theory, it shouldn't have any particular power. It should be literally coordinating. Feminism's working group kind of percolates transversely throughout this web of cells within the pool of the plenary. And by analyzing it with this prefigurative constitutional lens, what I try to do is extract from their movement documents the key principles of their organization, which we can also then read as emergent constitutional principles. So these are what I identified, and it wasn't very difficult because the early work of the working groups was literally to define, in their own terms, the principles of the organization. And this is what they came up with. And so these are kind of the principles of the radical democracy that they are very explicitly prefiguring. Quote one of their documents here, that they are a space of confluence that prefigures democratic, inclusive, and transparent systems of relation between citizens, movements, and public institutions. And my animation went out of order, but that's fine. They're nominally leaderless. They recognize very early on that they need media-facing spokespeople, but that this is a role that can very easily accumulate a lot of power and become an informal leadership position. So they dilute that leadership function through multiplication. They have not one, not two, but 8 spokespeople, and they bar those spokespeople from taking on other roles of power to maintain this assembly democracy, leaderless structure. Even there's a quote from an activist describing that. Even the representatives, the councillors, and if they got a mayor, then the mayor obviously would kind of become informal leaders, and there's not a lot they could do about that, and that's one of the key contradictions, I think, about this kind of radical horizontalist electoralism. But the idea was that those representatives would be subject to the binding plenary decisions, and I'm rushing a bit to finish, but let me get to the key point there. They were subject to these binding plenary decisions in a new kind of municipal framework they call a new institutional architecture, where here's the bottom-up mandates that I was just talking about. The movement party structure itself would be integrated in a way into the municipal government such that anyone can join these movement party assemblies. The assemblies make decisions that get fed up to the representatives who have to treat them as mandates, as binding decisions, and follow them. That didn't work out, but that was the very interesting idea. The other thing, just to go slightly out of order, back to the end of the last slide, that becomes crucial in the article I'm publishing with Karis is the very bottom bit there. You can see that, and I think this Zoom thing is covering it as well. But what I've kind of concluded about the role of the plenary is that from the perspective of constitutional theory, we think a lot in terms of constituent power versus constitutive power, and radical constitutional theory, such as it is, there's not a lot of it, but people like Antonio Negri have long been trying to think about how you keep constituent power open. Constituent power is like the founding power that legitimizes and creates a new constitution, and then usually it's consolidated, ossified in a constitutional text, a constitutive power. How do you avoid ossification in constitutive power and keep that constituent power open? Well, I think this is at least an attempt to literally do that. And so I call it essentially a permanent constituent assembly. Rather than a constituent assembly that creates a constitutive power, it is a constituent assembly that is the living, breathing constitution of the group itself. And then just before I finish, the converse of all this, didn't practice this nearly enough, clearly. Here's how the movement party groups kind of fit into the whole city hall infrastructure. Podemos, on the other hand, I think can also be read through this lens of prefigurative constitutionality. They weren't explicitly prefigurative, but they did claim to be, at least in the early days, a project for radical democracy. And because I like to define prefiguration not as what anarchists do, but as actually path dependence. It's the strategic deployment of path dependence, creating furrows in the road that make certain futures more likely than others. From that perspective, you could say that Podemos was not prefiguring radical democracy. It was prefiguring homogeneity, instrumentalism, hyper-leadership, which is a key word that comes out of the Spanish discourse at this time, and potentially revealing, therefore, an inherent contradiction in left populist strategies for radical democracy. And I should stop because I'm over time.
Yeah, take it away.
Where are your slides, Martin? Shall I open them for you?
Yeah, if you like. Yeah, they're
investigating in Ecologies. That's it. Oh, you can hide that. You want a clicker?
It only confused me, but thank you though. I am tempted. Are we still sharing on Zoom? Are these slides still Zoom visible? Okay, I'm Martin. I did a PhD here at the University of Manchester, which I completed about 2 years ago. This is bringing together some themes from that, theoretical, methodological, which I've sort of considered in light of the idea of this net system project. And here I go. So the PhD was called Post-Capitalism and the Post Office, the Role of Public Services in Utopian Futures. And it's about using the Post Office as a kind of main character to trace the fate of utopian hopes through a certain period of history, and like to imagine possible futures arising from a society through how its public services are organized. Along with organized labor, public services can be thought of as neoliberalism's most hunted quarry, perhaps. And presently, much of the public in the UK, certainly public sector, is in a state of structural dysfunction or out-and-out crisis. Thresholds for support are raised, contact times limited, services withdrawn, etc., etc. And this reduces people's routine contact with certain enacted values associated with what's public. And when they are encountered, these values are encountered under duress. Less guaranteed material support for them. The way they're framed in official logic, they're always subordinated to economic imperatives. It's about our position in the global race rather than the pursuit of a general social good, for example. And within, the way it feels to work in them, the way it feels to use them, the alienating structures which have been inserted into them to make them perform according to economic or ersatz economic logics. This has a cumulative effect on general experience, if I can talk about such a thing. Attacks on all things public have had a cumulative and profound effect on people's everyday experience. Implicit in every encounter with that which is public is a hegemonic message. The values, logics, and practices which underlie this idea of the public or the social good, they're not as serious or as important or authoritative or powerful relative to the values, logics, and practices of commerce and the market. And I think that the duress we encounter them in leads to them seeming like they have less practical utility, they're less credible, they'll have less authoritative weight in everyday life. And this affects our sense of things about what we share, what we collectively contribute to, what's official in terms of governance, what's open to all, the places and spaces where we account for an imagined everyone, and that what occurs in these spaces is evaluated according to non-market derived values that are still important. This is the sort of thing that gets subordinated, less reinforcement in day-to-day experience. And this also applies to certain forms of deliberative engagement and judgment too, just through the limitation we have in certain forms of encounter. And cumulatively, this all sends signals about what's possible in society, what's possible through society, what's possible for society. And this is where my interest in utopianism comes in. What are the possible directions or forms society can plausibly take from here? I think the imaginability of what that is very much affected by this effect on general experience from neoliberalism. So to transition more into my utopian self, public spaces and services and infrastructures can be viewed as carriers and living demonstrations of materially applied values, logics and practices which run more or less counter to capitalism's inherent logics. They comprise, of course, imperfectly a material pedagogical demonstration of values in action from which logical extrapolations to utopian futures can be made. There's lots of caveats, obviously, about this, but here we go. And to crank it up even further, the utopian. It's possible and in my view valuable to view these things as the real, extant, nascent, suppressed, I've shoved too many words into this sentence, but you know what I mean. Compromised and struggling life-supporting structures of utopian futures to be. You can ask me about that afterwards if you like. But back down to earth. Public services, spaces, infrastructures, pervasive. Clearly the word pervasive is important to me. Mundanely encounterable resources of practical need-meeting utility, and so the potential contribution that these can make to winning a hegemonic battle for common sense is something that seems worth keeping in mind. There's a big sort of critical theory dimension to this project. If I start explaining it on this slide, I'll get stuck here for the rest of the presentation time. And so I'm going to try my best to condense these into sort of snappy corporate taglines. Like Ernst Bloch, foregrounding the profound in the pedagogy of emancipatory action. Walter Benjamin, nurturing the conditions in which experience can endure and grow into subjectively rich. Herbert Marcuse, pushing back against alienating technological bureaucratic structures which strip people of material agency with respect to what they value. And I've used these thinkers also to think through the effects of neoliberalism and also to think how we repair, restore, move beyond neoliberalism in a just and non-oppression reproducing sort of way. To bring the sociology in, to make this into something we can investigate as sociologists and produce knowledge through as sociologists, I took two key utopian sociological projects, Wright's Real Utopias and Levitas's Utopia as Method. And it was a sort of harmonization, or at least the cobbling together of their projects was suggested by Frederick Jameson's An American Utopia, where early in the book he kind of browses through potential institutions of utopian dual power, on the way sort of discounting the possibility of the post office being a carrier of that, and my project is a sort of like 5-year rejoinder to that. Like, but Wright wants to be sort of more scientific, if that's not quite the right word, about how to get to a more utopian situation, looking at alternative institutions and how we might scale the institutions themselves up, or the logics which will work within them, deprioritizing the imaginative aspects of the utopian imagination. He wants this to be real and realized. Levitas is not keen on that because for her it loses what's potent about the utopian imagination, smashing institutions together, reshaping them in our minds, and like imagining other possibilities that aren't just a matter of scaling existing things up. And I thought it was possible to bring these together simply by, on the one hand, as part of the sociological method of investigating these things, you could use utopian fiction to extend this into the future. But also, I think, through cultivating a kind of disposition related to extant institutions that is focused on potential utopian trajectories that are kind of counterfactual, that aren't to do with like what's necessarily likely, but what is to do with what is desirable. I'm going to try and explain that a bit more comprehensively as I dash through the final slides. But altogether, it means looking at extant institutions and focusing simultaneously historic, empirical, and speculative lenses with this kind of like cultivated utopian gaze, and specific and particularly applied ethnographically, and to think about how to witness utopian possibility moving from history into possible futures. I found the work of Doreen Massey, Henry Lefebvre, and Walter Benjamin very useful in trying to think of how history and space work. And I sort of, drawing on threads from them, it took me to an idea of space as the sort of living and sparking front end of history, a history whose direction might yet be decisively altered in favor of the oppressed. And this sense that to change space is to change history as well. And this also gives a little utopian inflection to the comings and goings of everyday life, I think, too. And that's something that Henry Lefebvre, I think, gets across well in this reflection on possibility staring us in the face, mundane, and therefore generally unnoticed, whereas in the future it will be seen as a characteristic and scandalous trait of our era, the era of the decadent bourgeoisie. It's the fact that life is lagging behind what is possible, that it is held back. What incredible backwardness. Once pointed out, the contrast becomes staggeringly obvious. I mean, it's a bit, I wouldn't use this exact same language, but I think it's like about this cultivated gaze that we should be doing better. Everyday life should be more marvelous, given the capabilities that we have, the possibilities that are out there, but are withheld from us because of capitalism. And so, to think about this ethnographic thing, the cultivated utopian gaze, and to think about what happens to utopian possibilities moving through time and into possible futures, I developed this idea of ecologies of possibility. So, ecologies of possibility refers to the ways history and space are constituted, particular locations and moments to condition what's likely or unlikely to take place there. They're comprised of sets of political, economic, material, social, and imaginative conditions within which certain thoughts, feelings, behaviors, actions, and social formations are more or less possible, and for which certain futures might be or might have been more or less likely to arise. These locations and moments are layered and interwoven, interacting, irritating, and resonating with one another. The concept emphasizes and holds in attention the dimension of possibility in the social, tracing connections between what's possible at the micro and macro levels, and between existing conditions, what might have occurred or what might yet occur. Considering ecologies of possibility involves simultaneous consideration of the factual and the counterfactual, the likely and desirable. This is for my supervisor, that this bit came up. It is not a nostalgic or naive wishing away of reality, but an acknowledgement that reality, whilst undetermined but comprised of structure-born likelihoods or path dependencies, is also comprised of unrealized possibilities, both those that did not come to pass and those that may yet emerge. And making it a little bit more concrete, at the subjective level, people comprehend the different ecologies of possibility they find themselves in through relating them to others that they perceive of as existing, having existed, or as having the possibility of existing in other places and times. And people change friendship groups, jobs, move house, migrate, or wish they'd been born in other places and times because they have the sense that they might stand a better chance of flourishing within a different ecology of possibility. And so in applying this to research, it's thinking about what happens to real utopian possibilities as the ecologies which sustain and change over time. What are these ecologies comprised of? How do such possibilities and ecologies manifest empirically? What can they tell us about what needs to be changed such that their utopian content becomes more realizable? What might their realization be like? Okay, next system. So, bringing together the ideas of the public representing values in tension with capitalism, which, though attacked, compromised, complicit, might yet be vessels for counter-hegemonic common sense and utopian transformation, which comprise an ecology of possibility in themselves, and which contribute to the daily playing out of countless other ecologies of possibility. What could be changed that further activates their utopian potentials? After all this, we're coming to a very familiar sort of socialist shopping list. Okay, we crank up the obviousness of their active presence in the everyday, at community and neighborhood levels. We cultivate a pedagogical partisanship for the values they represent. They're functioning as fully demystified as possible, accessible and accountable to these communities and neighborhoods. Systems of meaningful democratic representation emanating from the neighborhood community levels through municipal, regional, and national levels, the possibility of well-paid public work available to everyone. Some less modest goals. The values, logics, and practices embodied within what's public expanded such that the values associated with the market and commerce lose their social dominance and are increasingly residualized. A denationalization of public services. Their modular integration, this is so easy for me to say. The actual doing, of course, is another matter, but their modular integration into complementary global systems of need meeting, paramount importance given to examining, this might not become clear why this is here, but it's more to do with this Benjaminian conception of history that's kind of built into the project. But a paramount importance given to examining and further unearthing the details of histories of oppression and exploitation and the fate of counterfactual possibilities to inform and orient the future expansion of public ecologies of possibility. Thank you.
So I'm just going to upload my slides. I have lost my presentation this morning, but thanks to the power of Google, I've recovered them. So
on the right in the
If you drag it over to the desktop and swap USBs. The clicker work.
okay. Sorry, how do I don't think I could be using it. Yeah.
As a laser pointer.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm very happy.
Wow, don't think I need the laser pointer, but okay. Thanks everyone. I'm slightly flustered because I've had a bit of a tech nightmare, so bear with me a little bit. So the paper that I'm going to give today has been pulled together specifically for the conference, so it's not part of a larger research project that I've been working on, but it draws together some of the things that I've been thinking about. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the business school at the University of Bristol, and I'm going to talk about enterprise. I'm going to look at some alternative perspectives on enterprise, particularly arguing that it could be viewed as a collective, common and commons endeavour, a bold undertaking that includes a combination of micropolitics and counter-hegemonic strategy, while it holds ambivalences and contradictions, possibly pulling through post-capitalist threads and even assisting in hospicing what needs to go. So I'm going to start with where I am. I'm leaning into being at the business school, which is something that's relatively new to me. We're just about to move to a big shiny new building. That's this. And it's right next to the main train station in Bristol, and it's been named the Enterprise Campus. And I think it embodies some of the contradictions bound up in the term enterprise, and as well as the tensions between the hopes and aspirations and the realities of the university and its place in the city. So on the university website, it states that the aim of the Enterprise Campus is for it to be porous, so porous to the city and porous to citizens. It will be an accessible and welcoming space with a cafe and meeting spaces open to the public. Some of the facilities have apparently been co-designed with local communities, and it aims, and these are quotes from the website, to foster exchange and collaboration on shared challenges for the city region in the process of building our future alongside the communities who share our city. There will be storytelling spaces, public art that isn't just random sculptures plonked in a square, and green spaces worked on with a local primary school. However, as you can see, it's a very imposing glass edifice. It's built right next to the railway station to encourage seamless flows of value and national and international ties with business and academia as part of a global economy. It towers over the local area with very prominent signage and has sucked up vast amounts of the university's resources, contributing to its finances being in a precarious state. Academics who are going to be working there don't feel very consulted about the interior spaces. There are no permanent offices, certainly not at the business school, for single academics. Little space for books, so they've had to ship all their books, take all their books home, and a potential 360-degree lecture theatre. That's going to be fun. So the teaching factory continues. So it embodies the best and the worst of the university as an organisation and its civic status, hopes and aspirations, and these very concrete realities. The term enterprise has come to be synonymous with neoliberalism and the way that it has been extended, that it's extended market principles beyond the economic sphere, and particularly through the incitement for individuals to conduct themselves in an entrepreneurial fashion. So to live their lives as if it were an enterprise. So that's to be proactive, self-reliant, accountable for themselves, personifying ambition, personal drive, calculation, and personal responsibility. They need to demonstrate self-initiative, autonomy, self-improvement, and self-belief. And of course, that's all based on an intensified form of individualism and a disavowal of vulnerability and interdependence. And of course, there's a lot of literature that states the downsides of this state of being. So people like Richard Sennett, Everardi Bifo, and others, it places much more of the burden on the individual that might otherwise be taken up by the state, and there is a huge personal cost, including increased levels of anxiety, depression, and physical illness among them. But there are other meanings and possibilities that can potentially be drawn out. As well as being used to describe commercial ventures, the terms enterprise, the roots of the term enterprise denote bold or difficult undertakings, an adventurous, daring disposition, or a readiness to take on challenges. The word enterprise originates from the 15th century Old French word, meaning an undertaking, linked to seize, to take, or to catch hold of. Oh, sorry. Writing about the caring ecology, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, of the Trieste mental health system, Francesco Salvini writes of the practice of enterprise in exactly these terms, of boldness, adventure, and challenge, but importantly as common seizure, as common and a commoning enterprise. He talks about enterprise as holding a complex reality together, of configuring spaces of contradiction and ambivalence. So this is a decentered model of mental health known as the Trieste model in Trieste in northern Italy. And it's distributed across the city. And as well as decentered mental health provision, the thing that interests me very much is there's also a network of cooperative enterprises. And the first one of these, the United Workers Social Cooperative, was set up in 1973 by Franco Basaglia, who was the head of the mental health system at that time, and dissolved the very large asylums, literally sometimes knocking down the walls in order to create a much more decentralized system that was actually based on relationality. So now there is a network of cooperatives that do everything from operating hotels and cafes cleaning local hospitals to making leather bags and purses. So, oops. Yeah, and that's a little kind of diagrammatic map of the system, mental health system, and this is the Rose Garden in the site of the former asylum in Trieste. This is one of the cooperatives. It's called Lister, and they make goods out of recycled fabric, recycled textiles. So there are co-ops managing the archives of one of the old asylums, growing and selling plants in the grounds, creating video, music and radio projects in the old morgue, providing further education programs, and employing peer support workers in hospital crisis centres. They're called social cooperatives, and this is because they have to have a third of their members has to be seen as disadvantaged in some way. So that's having some kind of disability or mental health issue, and that for that they have certain privileges. And as a key pivot for the functioning of the ecology, they have a dual role. So they provide jobs for people with mental health issues, but they also provide support services. And actually the co-op managers, the managers who work in the cooperatives actually liaise with the psychologists in the mental health system to talk about individual people. And it's really built on building relationships, long-term supportive relationships. The relationality is at the core of the Trieste system. So I'm going to go back to the term enterprise, and it appears 185 times in Gibbs and Graham's book Post-Capitalist Politics, which in itself I found really interesting. Their use of the term is very specific. So they say that it focuses on the ways in which different production units, that's their term, including businesses, government institutions, farms and households, generate and produce wealth. So it's the surplus, what happens to the surplus that's produced, and the decision-making processes around the surplus. And that's what they're interested in terms of enterprise. But also that these processes are important for creating new kinds of collective subjectivities. So following Foucault, they quote him to say not to try to liberate the individual from the economy, but to liberate us both from the economy and from the type of individualization that is linked to the economy. So for Gibbs and Graham, collective enterprise helps to open up the politics of economic possibility, to promote new forms of subjectivity as part of a community economy. So the community economy is their term for an economy that privileges care of the local community and its environment. And in fact, they draw on Leclerc and Muth as well in using community. Their aim is to use the community economy as an empty signifier, that we could talk about that. So new enterprises also emerge as part of their action research projects. The participants experience being in common through activities during the research, but that then are also invited to create together community-based enterprises. And again, the focus being relational and developing an economy of interdependence between people who thought they had nothing in common, and to aim to create new collective subjects. So for Gibbs and Graham, this act of recognising and creating interdependence is an important aspect of a counter-hegemonic politics. They take Muth and Leclerc's post-Gramscian understanding of counter-hegemony to strengthen a feminist recognition of the importance of micropolitics. So they can bring those two things together. And it can be argued that Muth and Leclerc's early post-hegemonic readings of Gramsci allow for that building of collective power from below. So they see that the combination of alternative discourses, shared language, embodied practices, Self-cultivation and in-place actions help to create a shift in the ways that actors think about the economy and therefore produces social change. There are also a number of other enterprises which consciously use Gibbs and Graham's perspective. Most interestingly, for me anyway, there are a couple that have been developed by artists and designers as both art projects and social enterprises. So they have this dual identity. Two examples are Company Drinks, created by artist Catherine Böhm, and Comunità Frizzante by designer Bianca Eisenbauer. They're both drinks companies that aim to foster community economies. And they could be described as cottage industries, but ones that actively and consciously produce sociability as well as jobs. So this is a diagram of Company Drinks, and this was set up in 2014 as part of an art commission. And it's a community space and social enterprise based in Barking and Dagenham. And drinks are made with and for local people, and they go and forage ingredients together, go hop picking, which also invokes some of the history of the area, as well as trying to build relationships. And now it's a co-working space, as well as trying to create a network of users and collaborators. One of the things that I find really interesting is that as part of its economy, the drinks have two different prices. So one for local people in Barking and Dagenham, and the other for the art world in central London. And so the way that the drinks circulate and create surplus, I think is really interesting. And of course, we've got kind of design labels which appeal to kind of art project, open views. The next one is again in the north of Italy. This is Comunità Frizzante, set up by Bianca Eisenbauer in Rovereto in North Italy. And it was set up, I think this was set up before Company Drinks, and it may have been even been the inspiration for Company Drinks. It was set up to bring together people from the local associations in the region. So, like a lot of Mediterranean countries, Italy has these kind of local cultural associations, and the idea was to bring people from those together to actively do and be together. And the quote says, "We are all unique ingredients capable of creating a tasty and diverse community." And they say they're united in the challenge of making doing together sparkling and tasty, and all the parts of the process of producing and selling and design to produce sociality and connection, as well as jobs and products. Other examples I could cite include commons partnerships developed by Abundance and the Fair Shares Association developed by academics from Sheffield Hallam Business School, both kind of hacking existing legal and political forms to try and create, again, different kinds of political subjectivity. I think for me, a key example is that they're part of organisational ecologies, as well as having some relational, subjective or micro-political aspect. And for me, that's the thing that's extremely key. One of the questions I always seem to come back to is one of strategy and coordination, and maybe that's something we can discuss a little bit more in the discussion. I'm going to skip a little bit. So I want to end by returning to the etymology of the term enterprise as an undertaking, with a link to those who undertake the collective tasks I've been talking about as undertakers. And I'm wondering if we might take this meaning with this link to the caring for the dead and take a role in the hospicing of the old forms of enterprise, of assisting those aspects of modernity, such as the disavowal of our interdependence, the reliance on violence and unsustainability, that, as Vanessa Machado de Oliveira suggests, restrict our ability to sense, relate, and imagine otherwise, and allow them to die in generative ways. Thank you.
I need to keyboard just.
Are we still good with the Zoom? Do I need to check or
Check. It should just be running a
I can't see anything?
the window that moves to the very bottom. Yeah, there we are. Still sharing and recording, so we're all good.
Thanks. On.
Yeah, it's right. It just moved.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Okay, thanks. So I'm Caris Hughes. I'm from the University of East London, where I'm a research fellow there. So I'm going to be talking today about what I think is a really crucial framework to think about the relationship between institutions and transformative change, essentially. So I'll start today by introducing the framework, which is governmentality, and more specifically, left governmentality. And then I'm going to talk about a case study, which is arguably one of the best examples we have in the world today of something like left governmentality at scale. And this is Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution, where they've come to power through the electoral route and the institutions of representative liberal democracy, but they're attempting to fundamentally transform the structures of the state and capitalist social relations, and at least have begun to attempt such a transformation. So governmentality. I don't know how many people are familiar with the concept, because usually it's one extreme or the other. So apologies to those who this is very much overly familiar. This is Foucault's idea that he introduced in the late 70s, which is that we're compelled to do things through our government through force, but a much more significant form of power in modern societies is this kind of subtle technocratic mode of power, which involves the construction of willing consent. So public policies and governing practices and the broader rationalities that these are situated within are techniques of governance, which kind of shape the sort of material, legal, discursive structures which sort of define the terrain of the possible. So in his words, to govern in this way is to structure the possible field of action. So since Foucault first developed this concept, a vast literature has developed, tens of thousands of studies, but it's almost all looking at governmentality within liberalism and latterly governmentality within neoliberalism. So we're all quite familiar now with this idea of how institutions construct us as atomized, competing, entrepreneurial agents, always in competition with one another. So what if we don't want to do that? What if we want to use institutions to build up collective capacities and collective agency, or maybe foster other positive qualities like empathy or creativity? Can you use the structures of institutions and the state in this way? Is this possible? It sort of feels like there's been like a conceptual blockage to thinking about governmentality in the context of progressive politics. However, in recent years, there has been a sort of smattering of studies developing the ideas of left governmentality and socialist governmentality. And they're kind of looking at different empirical contexts. So you've got some people looking at, one person looking at the Cuban Committees for the Defense of the Revolution as an instance of this. You've got Yugoslavian self-management. You've got a few studies looking at the failures of the Syriza government, arguing that what was missing was a theory of governmentality. But what they have in common is that they tend to think that progressive politics is kind of at an impasse, and that we're lacking the sort of conceptual and theoretical tools necessary, and that this framework can be useful for addressing a couple of interconnected problems, which is one, trying to move from resistance to thinking about propositional politics, and two, thinking about state power, but thinking about it differently. So today I'm picking up this framework, and I'm going to suggest one way we can flesh it out, and I'm also going to talk about its analytical utility, and I'm going to do this through looking at the Venezuelan case, because this is arguably the best example of somewhere that has been trialed at a large scale in the world today. So the 1999 Venezuelan Constitution and the Bolivarian process that it inaugurated is based on a fundamentally different constitutional model to the traditional liberal constitutional model. So where liberal constitutions are they're sort of designed to limit the capacities of citizenry in their collective capacity, this constitutional model is explicitly about building up the collective capacities of the citizenry. And so it does this through a range of constitutional provisions and laws, but the idea is to build up the constituent power of the people and channel it into the functioning of the state, the making of laws. So I don't know who's familiar with the idea of constituent power and constituted power, but this is the kind of framework that it's based on. So it got famous during the French Revolution, the idea of constituent power as the primary force that created the state, and is the legitimating source for the state. But within liberal constitutions, it doesn't really have any teeth. It's just a mythical idea. But within these kind of constitutions, the idea is to try and make it tangible. So the Venezuelan government did experiment with multiple sort of institutional forms to attempt to make this tangible. But from around 2006, it became the communal councils that was the main vehicle for doing this. So they are institutions of collective self-government at the neighbourhood level, made up of 200 to 400 families, and people can suggest projects for their communities. It might be like a new day centre or some other service or a productive enterprise, and they put together a project proposal, and if it's approved, they get money from the government. So in the first year of their being initiated, they got $1 billion from the state to the communal councils, and they still, until the intensification of the crisis in recent years, were supported through substantial grants from the state. And I think what the figures, but I think within the first couple of years, 26,000 communal councils were registered. I think that figure's at about 50,000 now. Obviously, this is just what's on the books. It's not necessarily entirely accurate, but repeated studies have suggested that 30% of the population has participated in their local communal council. But crucially, the communal councils are not an end in themselves. They are the building blocks of a different kind of state. So in 2010, the law of communes was passed. Communes are larger self-governing entities that bring together a collection of communal councils to work on bigger scale projects. And the communes, as it says in Article 6 here, the commune has as its fundamental purpose the building of the communal state through the promotion, propulsion, and development of protagonistic participation. And this future communal state is a form of socio-political organisation founded in the social state of law and justice established in the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, in which power is exercised directly by the people by means of communal self-governments with an economic model of social property and endogenous and sustainable development that permits the achievement of supreme social happiness of Venezuelans in the socialist society. The basic structural cell of the communal state is the commune. And so just to draw your attention to the point that this future communal state is described as founded on the existing constitution. So the idea is to form this fundamentally different kind of state via the existing constituted order. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about how they envision this happening, and I'm going to talk about how I think left governmentality is a really helpful framework to make sense of that logic, the logic on which it's based. Okay. I'm running out of time. So a governmentality analysis of the communal councils, I'm going to kind of whiz through. Looking at the technocratic requirements around setting up a communal council is quite illuminating to this core logic that I'm talking about. So to set up a communal council, you have to adhere to quite a lot of procedural steps. So you have to do a census of the local community. You have to go to every house, tell them what's happening and invite them to participate. And then meetings have a quorum requirement of 20% of people over the age of 15 in an area to be binding. So these requirements send a message that you matter and you're a member of a collective. And if we kind of appreciate the historical context, in the kind of historically, in the pre-Chavez era, the sort of key cleavage in Venezuelan society is between the citizen and the non-citizen, rather than middle class, working class. So this message of you are being counted, and counted by the state, albeit indirectly, is significant. Also, they have to name their communal council. They have to write a constitution, and they have to decide the boundaries of the communal council. So it doesn't map onto any existing map. They have to decide it themselves. So all of these requirements are encouraging people to act as a collective and to think collectively. So I would argue that this functions much like countless examples of neoliberal governmentality, shepherding people into certain kinds of behaviours and subjectivities, but in entirely the opposite direction. Instead of creating atomized individuals, it's creating a new collective with new collective capacities. So I would also argue that this logic, which we're looking at the micro scale here, can actually help us explain the wider project of transforming the whole state. So when you look at the project of transforming the state, there are kind of different ways you can look at what they've tried to do, sort of like two prongs I'm talking about here. So the creation of communes and communal councils has been understood in terms of dual power by both critics and advocates of the project. But alongside this, there's another strategy that might appear quite different, which we might call creating revolutionary bureaucrats. The Francisco de Miranda Front was an organisation set up in the early 2000s with the objective of training a new generation of civil servants to be the frontline cadres for reforming the state from within. So these sort of young popular class Venezuelans were sent off to Cuba for months-long training in politics and public administration. And they came back and they were generally staffed lots of different government ministries. You can kind of see, this is a documentary called Commune Under Construction by Azzolini and Resler. And anyone interested in this process, I really recommend checking this out. And here you can see some of these kind of radicalized civil servants in action. So this is Juliana Diaz, and she's from the newly nationalized CanTV, which is the telecommunications company of the state. And she's giving a workshop in a working class Caracas barrio. And she is advocating people set up technical telecommunication committees. Now, when she does this workshop about setting up these committees, she gets this quite challenging question from this man, and he says, let me just get it right. If this assembly were taking place in the wealthy part of the city, we would already have the whole structure. The problem is that the structure's missing, so we're paying the price for being poor. This is the price for being poor. And her response is quite interesting. So she says, CanTV has 17 divisions, and only one of them is supervising this project. The others are not interested. So we have to be on them the whole time because, yes, we pay the price for being poor because they measure us through numbers. They rate us due to our regular income and whether we have work. If you registered C, you could forget the telephone. We're declared incapable. Yeah, and I have to tell you, this mindset persists in the company. And then she adds, this space is not only for talking, because if we have to wait for an answer for too long, then the day will come and we'll have to take off our identity badge, our CanTV identity badge, and reclaim CanTV. So, like, rather than defend her employer, she validates his critique, exposes the company's exclusionary logic, and allies herself with those on the outside. So the workshop illustrates the government's strategy to transform bureaucratic structures, which, despite their formal subordination to a new government administration, still operate according to an earlier logic. And so the approach is to create new departments, staff them with radicalized civil servants, with the specific remit and authority to mobilize the protagonistic agency of those excluded from the existing system. And if we look at this through a left governmentality lens, we can see that this is the same logic that's playing out within the communes and the communal councils, which is using sort of institutional resources, spaces, processes to mobilize, support, and facilitate popular protagonism, or constituent power, as it's called. So you're going to have to forgive a very whistle-stop. Okay, well, have to forgive a very whistle-stop tour of the last 10 years in Venezuela. But after the death of Chavez in 2013, and with the intensification of the economic crisis, the process took a different direction, and the government rode back from emphases on participation and popular protagonism. Most of the funding to the communes and communal councils was ended in the context of intense external and internal pressures. And there's countless cases of sort of bureaucratic obstruction, co-optation, and repression of the communal institutions. This is a quote from Angel Prado, who's an important communard leader, and he was blocked from taking up a mayor position that he'd legitimately won. He says, the many politicians who don't work for the people is what affects us most. Unfortunately, they are politicians associated with the PSUV. Right now, many of our representatives and functionaries are in fact doing the work of the right, installing the logic of corruption, bureaucracy, and clientelism. A reformist logic seems to dominate the landscape. And as Dario Azzolini puts it, the power asymmetry between constituent and constitutive power created severe contradictions and difficulties for the envisioned transformation. Yeah, and then obviously in January of this year, the long-threatened imperial assault by the US was realized, 100 people were killed, and President Maduro was kidnapped with his wife and is now held in US custody. And there's an interim president in charge, and the future of the Bolivarian project appears acutely uncertain, to say the least. So is the Bolivarian project over? And what does this tell us about this strategy for change? From the perspective of the people at the heart of this process, the communards themselves, the answer is defiantly no. This Chris Gilbert says, writing in 2023, commune building goes forward in an almost miraculous way in the country, driven by grassroots forces. So communes have continued to be built, albeit slowly, and develop new productive enterprises, but mainly driven from the grassroots without state support. In 2022, the Communard Union was formed, which brings together over 50 communes with the objective of building a new communal state from below. And then more recently, in a perhaps surprising turn of events, the government seems to have re-embraced the communal movement. So there's been money put into these nationwide participatory budgeting projects, which are funded by the state but managed by the communes. Angel Prado, who I mentioned before, is now the Minister of Communes. And there's moved to try and amend the constitution to recognise the commune itself within the structure of the constitution. So how do we make sense of all this? Applying a left governmentality lens is helpful for making sense of this extremely complex situation, which I think does justice to what protagonists are trying to achieve. So the left governmentality lens reminds us the state is not a monolithic thing. It's a conglomeration of processes, spaces, personnel, and they're not all working in concert. And the struggle between the communes and parts of the state is a struggle, including sometimes the president himself, is a struggle to establish a different kind of constitutive power. I think this take discourages, this framework discourages reductive takes, which are based on ethical grounds, calling people traitors or heroes, or revolutionaries or reformists. Instead, we're encouraged to look at each decision and look at how does it change the terrain of the possible, or the possible field of action. In terms of assessing the strategy, the continued existence of the communes, even without at times the support of the state, is evidence of the success of this strategy, albeit limited to this point. Also, vast numbers of people have signed up for the Bolivarian National Militia, which is a civilian defence force. According to some sources, this is millions of people promising to defend the country in the event of a ground invasion. And the communes themselves have scaled up efforts for food sovereignty to prevent vulnerability to international attack. So these are not spontaneous popular uprisings, entirely spontaneous. These are in part the outcome of the institutional structures or the form of governmentality that we've been looking at. Thanks.